The modern transnational corporation, as we understood it, was created during this time period, not as a matter of accident, but it was an intentional, deliberate act. They weren't originally called corporations per se, they were called joint stock companies. And the original joint stock companies were created as an intentional, deliberate instrument of empire. So now, to illustrate how this works, we'll do another little exercise. In this exercise, or this little story, I'll be the king. Why do y'all think I get to be the king in this story? Answer? Because I'm telling the story. See, George Lakoff told us that not only do we understand the world through stories, but that we would be well behooved to actually ask who's telling the stories in any given culture, because that matters too. The American Revolution is not merely a rejection of monarchy as a form of rule. It is that, but the American Revolution is also a people's uprising against corporate rule. You see, the magic can only happen when enough people, when somebody stands up against injustice and oppression, and then somebody to her left stands up, and somebody to her right stands up, and you get this kind of collective standing up, that's when the magic happens. And at this point, I just got to say, may the goddess bless the Occupy movement. Government is a construct. We create it. We, the people, are described as being free and sovereign. What does the word sovereign mean again?
King.
No, the authority to rule. Because the king isn't sovereign anymore. We kicked his butt out. So who is part of we the people in 1789 with the rights?
That's defined in Article 1, Section 2, Section 9.
Okay, but their characteristics. Who is a legal person? Just give us their broad characteristics.
Free white man.
They had their own land.
Yeah.
White, male. Right. So you have to be white, you have to be a man, you have to be over 21, you have to be a property owner. And in almost every state, you have to be in the right religion. So the thing is, I am angry, but I also recognize that the anger that I have is a righteous anger because of why I'm mad. Because it's a moral anger. And righteous anger is really unique because if it provokes you to action, you can transform your anger into a genuine, joyous experience. It's an amazing thing. It's almost like an emotional alchemy. But if you actually will embrace the fact that you have a moral outrage about immorality. That's something that goes very deep, and I think that too many progressives have stayed stuck just on individual policy issues and are not willing to go deep enough into what it is that really motivates us. And you know, I got to confess that what you're hearing from me is the work of a cognitive scientist named George Lakoff. I see a couple of y'all know that name. George Lakoff also brilliantly as a cognitive scientist said that we as human beings don't make sense of the world through facts and logic. We make sense of the world through the stories we tell each other. And the stories that are told over and over in any given society become the cultural narrative about how we understand how the world works. Right? And so if you want to be effective, you need to learn to tell stories. And so, since I want to be effective, I'm going to tell a story. I'm going to tell a story on how it came to be that large transnational corporations are not just exercising power today. I'm going to tell a story on how it came to be that these corporations are ruling us. As surely as masters once ruled slaves, or kings once ruled subjects, unelected and unaccountable corporate CEOs are ruling us because they're making the decisions. They're making decisions about how our society should be operated. And we, the people, are left to choose between paper or plastic at the grocery store. We get to choose between Coke or Pepsi. You know, we can have 17 different types of toothpaste. Go to any reasonably well-stocked department store, you'll see what I mean. As long as you can pay for it, there are consumer choices. But when it comes to how our society is organized, we almost never get a chance to talk about it. And so, now I'm going to tell a story, and as I tell the story, I want you to think consciously about whether or not the story I'm telling is a story that only progressives could hear, appreciate, understand, and act on, or is this a cultural story that can transcend party affiliation? Is this a story that can transcend ideologies? Is this an American story that actually can find root across race, across gender, across class? Because that's my challenge, is to be able to craft a story that has the positive message about the liberty, justice, and equality that we were told we lived in this country. Now, my friends, I want to take you back to 1789 and share with you what it once took to form a corporation, and this was true for the next 50 to 75 years. First, you had to identify a public need that was not being met by businesses that did not have limited liability. And you didn't just go to the Secretary of State, your application went to the entire House of Representatives of state government, and they debated it and voted on it, and you had to get a majority vote. But even if that happened, you're not through, because now your application process goes to the state Senate, where they debate it and take a vote on it, and you have to get a majority vote. But even if that happens, you're still not through, because now your application goes to the governor, who has to be willing to sign it. Does that sound anything like a corporate chartering process today? Of course not. What did I just describe, actually? A law. I just described the legislative process. Anybody besides me work to try to get a law passed? Am I the only one? Several hands go up. So anybody, how easy is that? It's very difficult, right? The lawmaking process requires a lot of political effort, mobilization, etc. The point I'm making is there was a time in our country where just the application, the procedural process of getting limited liability incorporation was a very high threshold. Oh, and by the way, if you were granted the privilege to incorporate, because incorporation is not a right, it's a legal privilege. If you were granted that privilege, do you know how long your corporate charter would last? 5 years, 10 years, at most 20 years. No corporate charter was ever longer than 20 years, and not a single, so all of them were limited in time. And at the end of that time period, the corporate charter just dissolved. I mean, the business could go on, right? The things that made it up, but the legal construct of limited liability evaporated. And if you wanted to continue your business with limited liability, you had to reapply all over again. Oh, and by the way, if you ever did any kind of business other than the specific meeting the public need that you had identified in your original application, you know what happened to your corporate charter? Revoked. Corporate charters were revoked for going ultra vires, or what's known as beyond the authority. Oh, and by the way, even if you were operating in the limited time period that your charter had been issued, even if you were doing the narrow specific public need that you had identified, if in doing your business, if you ever acted outside the public interest in any way, you know what happened to corporate charter? Revoked. Corporate charters were routinely revoked for just acting out of the public interest. A pop quiz. Is there a single one of the Fortune 500 corporations that could even exist and operate the way they do today if we had those restrictions? No. I don't think a single one could. But corporate personhood is the concept that a corporation must be treated as a person with constitutional rights, and that perverts the democratic republican form of government. It basically steals our sacred right to self-government. And what's particularly atrocious to me as a lawyer, they use the legal system and the courts to legalize the theft of our sacred right to self-government. And they tell us there's nothing that we can do about it because it's legal. We have to put up with it. We have to accept it. Well, I say, and the Move to Amend Coalition says, ya basta. Enough already. This is ridiculous, and we know it's ridiculous. And we also know that we have to do what people before us have done and build a movement to educate, to organize, to activate people, not just around individual policies, but around the core structures of the system of how it's operating, because corporate constitutional right is a legal doctrine created by the courts. The only way to fix it is a constitutional amendment. And our amendment, our proposed amendment, we can talk about it in detail if you like, but I want to be clear. The Move to Amend amendment has two processes. One, abolish in its entirety the idea that a corporation of any type is a person with constitutional rights. Sometimes I call this the well-duh demand, because this is obvious to any sane person, right, if you just talk it through. Only human beings have constitutional rights. Corporations are artificial entities created through a state legislative enactment process. As an artificial entity, they have legal privileges, but not rights. Legal privileges are subject to the political process. Your rights, my constitutional rights are not subject to the political process. And may I point out, this is very important, That goes for both for-profit and non-profit corporations too. They're both artificial entities. We have to be intellectually honest. We can't say, oh, well, we don't like for-profit corporations, so they don't have constitutional rights, but we like non-profits, so they get constitutional rights. No. We'll never get principled conservatives to join us. We'll never actually get people who are not political progressives to join, but I want to go even further. We also will be doing a disservice to the movement, because don't you see, if we exempt nonprofits, the ruling elites will just create a bunch more nonprofits and completely subvert everything we've done. You know, nonprofits like the Chamber of Commerce, nonprofits like the American Legislative Exchange Council, nonprofits like Citizens United, which was a nonprofit corporation. I'm not trying to vilify corporations. Remember, I'm not anti-corporation. But I want you to remember this. Think of, if it's a hot day here in Augusta, Georgia, in the summertime, that's not hard to imagine, right? Hot summer day, and you come over and you see me cutting some tomatoes, and you say, David, what are you doing? And I say, well, I'm cutting these tomatoes. I grew them myself. They're organic, of course. I'm going to make a gazpacho soup. Would you like to join me? Is that knife good or bad? Well, it's good, right? I mean, I'm making a soup. I'm going to share it with my new friend Ivan. Now imagine that he comes over. It's the same hot summer day. I'm cutting tomatoes. He says, David, what are you doing? And I say, ah! And I lunge at him put the knife to his throat. Is that knife good or bad? It's a trick question. The knife is neither good nor bad. The knife is an instrument. An instrument or a tool can be put to good use or bad use, an appropriate use or an inappropriate use. You see, the thing is, I don't think there's such a thing. I think that we make a mistake if we really talk about corporate social responsibility. What we should actually be talking about is, are we creating legal mechanisms and institutions that are promoting peaceful, just, democratic, ecologically sustainable society?
The way how the corporations are trying to do the public service,
yes,
is through the foundations that they come
yes.
out with, like a Bill Gates Foundation, and you know, they go for the good of the education and health and all that stuff.
I said that the American revolutionaries weren't calling for a more socially responsible king, but you know what? 10 years before the revolution actually erupted, those people who would become revolutionaries, they were writing letters to the king that went like this. Oh, Father King, we, your humble children, come before you to beg that you intervene on our behalf. Because the royal governor, your royal governor, is administering unfair rules. Remember, unfair business and trade rules, international rules. It wasn't just taxation without representation, it was the Navigation Act, the Stamp Act, a whole series of international trade rules. Oh, Father King, English Parliament are passing these rules that are unfair to us and benefit the East India Company. Quick pop quiz. Do y'all know what percentage of the English Parliament passing these laws at this time owned shares in the East India Company? What percentage? Say it louder. 100%. I wonder if that's related, sir.
Absolutely.
Oh, Father King, they said, would you please intervene on our behalf? It was the most sniveling, groveling language you can imagine. And think about it. 10 years, something happened. Something happened in their thoughts, something happened in their actions, something happened in their hearts to convince them to get up off their knees, to stand up straight, put their shoulders back, put their chin up, look directly at the king, you know, the king who claimed cultural authority from God, and see behind the king the most powerful military the world had ever assembled, and said, you're all done, get out, we're going to do it different. Actually, we'd be much better off if we actually said, you know what, we don't actually need to create the non-profit industrial complex to mirror the militarily industrial complex. Like, why don't we actually just have a fair tax system and let people make donations and organize themselves voluntarily? So I actually don't buy this notion that because the rich create nonprofits to avoid paying taxes, and then they get to choose what they fund or not. I actually think that, frankly, we've all collectively created the wealth of this country. The governing process is how we're supposed to actually be making decisions. And frankly, if we actually thought about that and conducted ourselves differently, we wouldn't need these nonprofits to actually be doing social services or advocating, because frankly we'd organize ourselves and advocate for our own interests.
You're familiar with the Somerset decision?
Of course.
Okay, and of course the authors of Slave Nation indicated that that was the motivation for the revolution more so than...
So this gentleman has asked a very, I don't know, but it may well be you and I are the only ones who even understood your question yet. So I want to be clear, because it's an important point that he's made. The Somerset decision is actually a decision in Britain. And it's the decision in Britain, in the legal system, that actually outlawed slavery in Britain. But even though in the colonies, remember this is like 1740, 1750,
right,
like that. Yeah, it's definitely before the American Revolution. There is a historical argument to be made that the Somerset decision actually provoked the American Revolution. Why? Because think about it. Up to that point, most of the politically active colonists, the white colonists who were the ruling elite here, were arguing that they should be more like Britain, that they were British sovereign citizens, and that the rules that were being passed that benefited the East India Company and other entities that were actually housed in Britain were illegitimate because they were British citizens. They should be on par. Well, if slavery gets abolished in Britain, then many feared that slavery would soon be abolished in the American colonies, and that flipped the script for them, and they started all of a sudden to wanting to separate from England. Is this making sense now? So that's the question I think that the gentleman, what's your name, sir?
Michael.
Michael, did I get that more or less right?
Yeah, I mean, that was the catalyst for the, I mean, they argued that that was the catalyst for the revolution because their economic viability was dependent upon the enslavement of African people. And
that's
so,
right.
And they were still under the auspices of the British Crown, so if they dissolved the institution of slavery, then that would directly impact on their ability to continue their
oppression.
Yeah, exactly.
And Michael, and I'm glad you brought it up too, because that's a level of, honestly, and I'm not being sycophantic with you, but that's a level of political and historic sophistication I don't normally get to in these lectures. But since you bring it up, I do want to point something out, Michael. It shows the concept of legal personhood under law and what that actually means, right? And that how important that is, which is why it is, to my money, actually an insult to every movement that has ever happened in this country when the courts say that a corporation has legal personhood.
Right.
It is an insult to the abolitionists and the women's suffrage movement and the trade union movement and the civil rights movement. It is an insult because it's also worth pointing out that when actual human beings have been able to force themselves into the Constitution to be described as a person with rights, it takes movements. And oftentimes those movements are brutally repressed. People have to be willing to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, blows. The legal system and the courts, with 5 votes on the Supreme Court, do it like that. That ain't how this country's supposed to operate, Michael. In fact, I'm reminded of one of the great American political theorists of all time who said, power concedes nothing without a demand. Who am I talking about?
Frederick Douglass.
Frederick Douglass, I think one of the great American political thinkers, right? I mean, like, really a genius. But many people know that quote, but forget the rest of it, because Douglass also said this: power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. You show me the exact amount of injustice that a people are willing to tolerate, and I will show you the exact amount of injustice that will be visited upon them. And it will continue until it is resisted by deeds or blows or both. The point is, Douglass was actually telling us, his own contemporaries, and he tells us today, we have to actually think of ourselves as a resistance movement making concrete demands. That's what Move to Amend is doing. We are in the early stages. This is a consciousness-raising meeting as much as it is anything else. We are starting to learn the idea of what it is. You'll see that we've had 7 regional convergences across the country. The reason I want you to to have this is because in Tallahassee, December 14th through 16th, we're going to be gathering together. Probably 100 or more people will come. We're hoping that people from all across the Southeast come. We've done 6 of these already. And now imagine, we just spent basically 90 minutes together, right? Now imagine if you spent all day doing this kind of work. You know, like what we did in Charlotte, only instead of on a bunch of issues, that we focus just on corporate constitutional rights. So if you're really inspired by this, you can learn and go to workshops on how to organize a Move to Amend local affiliate, how to run a Move to Amend resolution campaign, how to run a Move to Amend citizens initiative campaign. How should nonprofits be treated under law? How do you build a multiracial movement? And honestly, I'm going to say, how do white people learn how to put themselves under the leadership of people of color? How do we recognize white skin privilege and still be in respectful relation with people of color? These are things that we don't normally spend time talking about. Move to Amend spends time talking about it. So,
a production of AnibalShow.
AnibalShow.com